They say pride comes before the fall, but nobody expected the fall to happen in 3 hours inside a recording studio. Eric Clapton was God. That's what the graffiti said on the walls of London in 1966. Clapton is God. Written in spray paint across the underground stations, scrawled on bathroom walls, repeated like a prayer by every guitarist who picked up an instrument and dreamed of being half as good. And Eric Clapton believed it. Why wouldn't he? He had earned it. Cream was dominating the charts. His blues playing was considered untouchable, and every musician in London knew that when Clapton walked into a room, you stepped aside and let the master work. But on one afternoon in December 1966, Eric Clapton said something he would regret for the rest of his life. He called Jimi Hendrix loud noise, just a gimmick, all flash and no substance. What happened in the 3 hours that followed didn't just humble Eric Clapton. It broke something inside him that 50 years later he still can't talk about without his voice cracking. Before we step into Olympic Studios on that December afternoon, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear comes from the people who were there, who watched a God realize he was human, who witnessed the moment everything Eric Clapton believed about himself, and music shattered like glass. December 1966. London is cold and gray and alive with a music scene that's exploding in directions nobody predicted. The Beatles have just released Revolver. The Stones are pushing boundaries. The Who are smashing instruments and rewriting what rock can be. And in the middle of all this creative chaos, Eric Clapton is the untouchable guitar god. He had left the Yardbirds because they were too commercial, had formed Cream with Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker, and was in the process of creating blues rock that critics were calling revolutionary. Clapton's playing was pure, technical, rooted in American blues, but elevated to something that felt almost classical in its precision and control. When Clapton played, every note was exactly where it should be. Every bend was perfect. Every solo was structured and beautiful and impossible to criticize. He was 21 years old and already being compared to the greatest guitarists who ever lived. Into this world arrives Jimi Hendrix, an American, unknown in the States, but brought to London by Chas Chandler, the bass player from the Animals who had seen Jimi playing in a small club in New York and had the vision to understand what he was witnessing. Chandler brings Jimi to London in September 1966 and immediately starts building buzz. He gets Jimi a band, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, with Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums. He gets them gigs at small clubs. He makes sure the right people hear about this wild American guitarist who plays left-handed, who plays with his teeth, who sets his guitar on fire, who creates sounds that nobody has heard before. The word spreads through the London music scene like electricity. There's this guy, this Jimi Hendrix, and he's doing something different, something that might be brilliant or might be just noise and spectacle. Nobody's quite sure yet. Eric Clapton hears about Jimi Hendrix the way everyone hears about the new sensation. Through the grapevine, through other musicians, through the club owners and session players who make up the ecosystem of London music. The descriptions he hears are not particularly flattering. They say Jimi plays behind his back, between his legs, with his teeth. They say he uses feedback and distortion and electronic effects that have nothing to do with real guitar playing. They say he's more performer than musician, more showman than artist. Clapton listens to these descriptions with the mild disdain of someone who has mastered his instrument through discipline and study, who believes that guitar playing is about purity and technique and respect for the blues tradition, not about gimmicks and theater. When someone suggests that Clapton should go see Jimi Hendrix play, Clapton's response is dismissive. He says he doesn't need to see a guy who relies on volume and tricks to cover up for lack of real ability. But Chas Chandler is persistent. Chandler knows that if he can get the established London guitar elite to acknowledge Jimi, the rest will follow. He knows that Eric Clapton's opinion carries weight, that if Clapton endorses Jimi, doors will open that are currently closed. So Chandler works his connections. He talks to people who know Clapton. He suggests that maybe Clapton should at least hear Jimi play before dismissing him. He plants seeds, and eventually those seeds bear fruit. In early December 1966, Chandler manages to arrange what seems like a casual encounter but is actually a carefully orchestrated event. Clapton is recording at Olympic Studios in Barnes, working on tracks for Cream's upcoming album. Chandler suggests to the studio management that it would be interesting to have Jimi come by, maybe sit in on a session, let some of the London musicians see what he can do. The studio agrees. A session is arranged for a December afternoon when Clapton and Cream will be there working. Jimi is invited to come and jam. The afternoon of the session, Olympic Studios is busy with the usual controlled chaos of a professional recording environment. Cream is set up in the main room, working through arrangements, laying down takes, doing the meticulous work of crafting songs that will become classics. Eric Clapton is in his element, commanding the space, his guitar tone clean and perfect, his playing technically flawless. The engineers and producers defer to him. The other musicians watch him with respect. This is his domain. Around 3 in the afternoon, Jimi Hendrix arrives at the studio. He comes with Chas Chandler and Noel Redding, carrying his Stratocaster, dressed in clothes that immediately mark him as different, more flamboyant, more colorful than the relatively conservative style of the London blues scene. A studio assistant who was there that day later testified that when Jimi walked in, the room went quiet for a moment. People stopped what they were doing and looked at this tall black American with the wild hair and the outrageous clothes and the left-handed guitar. Clapton was in the control room listening to a playback. Someone told him that Jimi Hendrix had arrived. Clapton's response, remembered and repeated by multiple people who were present, was to shrug and say something like, "Let's see what the noise machine can do." They go into the main studio. Introductions are made. Clapton is polite but cool, professional but distant. He shakes Jimi's hand, says something brief about welcome to London, then goes back to his guitar. Someone suggests that maybe Jimi could play something, could show the guys what he's working on. There's a moment of awkwardness, because this isn't really Clapton's session to invite people into, but the studio management has arranged it, and Clapton isn't going to be rude enough to refuse directly. He says, "Sure, fine, let's hear what you've got." Jimi plugs in his Stratocaster. He's using a setup that's already different from what Clapton uses. More effects, more distortion. The amp settings pushed into ranges that blues purists consider excessive. A sound engineer who was there later said that when he saw Jimi's amp settings, he assumed something was wrong with the equipment, that nobody would intentionally play with that much gain and volume. But Jimi knows exactly what he's doing. He's not trying to play clean and pure like Clapton. He's trying to make the guitar do things it's not supposed to do, to push the instrument beyond its intended boundaries, to create sounds that feel alive and dangerous and out of control even though he's controlling every note. Jimi starts playing. He doesn't start with anything particularly flashy or technical. He starts with a blues riff, something traditional, something that should be familiar to everyone in the room. But within seconds, it's clear that something is different about the way Jimi plays even a simple blues pattern. The notes have a quality to them that's hard to define, a kind of vocal expressiveness that makes the guitar sound like it's crying or screaming or pleading. Clapton is standing to the side, arms crossed, watching with the expression of someone who's seen this before, who's not going to be impressed by flashy technique covering up for lack of substance. Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker are watching too, curious but skeptical. The studio engineers are trying to adjust levels to accommodate Jimi's volume, which is significantly louder than what they're used to working with. Jimi plays the blues riff for maybe 30 seconds. Then he starts to change it, to bend it, to add things that don't belong in traditional blues, but that somehow make sense in the context of what he's creating. He's using feedback now, letting the guitar sustain and howl in ways that should sound like chaos, but that he's shaping into melody. One of the engineers later testified that watching Jimi play was like watching someone speak a language that sounded like English, but that contained extra words and grammar that didn't exist in any normal version of the language. You could recognize elements of blues, elements of rock and roll, elements of rhythm and blues, but Jimi was combining them in ways that created something entirely new, something that didn't have a name yet because it had never existed before that moment. Clapton's body language starts to change. His arms uncross. He steps closer. The expression on his face shifts from dismissive to confused, to something that people who were there described as disturbed, as if he's hearing something that challenges fundamental assumptions about how a guitar is supposed to sound and what it's supposed to be capable of doing. Jimi plays for maybe 3 minutes, just warming up, just showing a fraction of what he can do. When he stops, the room is silent. Nobody knows what to say because what they just heard doesn't fit into any category they have for evaluating guitar playing. Jack Bruce, Cream's bass player, is the first to speak. He says something like, "That was interesting, that was different. Where did you learn to play like that?" Jimi's response is casual, almost shy. He says he's just been playing around with some ideas, trying to see what the guitar can do if you stop worrying about rules. Ginger Baker, never one to hold back his opinions, says it's loud and messy, but admits there's something there, some raw talent that could be developed if Jimi learned proper technique. Clapton says nothing. He's staring at Jimi's guitar like it's some kind of alien technology, like he can't figure out how those sounds came out of an instrument that looks exactly like the one he's holding. Someone suggests they should jam together, that Clapton and Jimi should play something, see how they work together. There's hesitation. This wasn't part of the plan. But Chandler is there encouraging it, saying it would be great to hear how these two different styles interact, and the studio people think it would be interesting for the session. And eventually Clapton agrees, says, okay, let's play something simple. Let's do a 12-bar blues in E, something standard that they both know. They start playing. Clapton goes first, establishing the rhythm, playing clean, precise blues guitar that demonstrates perfect technique and deep understanding of the form. It's textbook blues, beautiful and correct, and exactly what you would expect from someone who has studied the masters and absorbed their lessons completely. Jimi comes in after Clapton establishes the progression. At first, Jimi plays supportive rhythm, staying in the background, letting Clapton lead. They play through one full progression like this, Clapton out front, Jimi supporting. Then on the second progression, Jimi starts to add little fills, little responses to what Clapton is playing, not trying to take over but suggesting possibilities, showing different ways the same progression could be approached. Clapton notices and responds, playing a slightly more complex solo, showing off his technical ability, demonstrating why he's considered the best. Jimi listens. Then when his turn comes, he takes what Clapton just played and turns it inside out, using the same notes but bending them and stretching them and adding harmonics and feedback until the simple blues progression sounds like something alive and wild and barely contained. An engineer who was running the recording equipment later said that watching this interaction was like watching two people have a conversation where one person speaks in complete, grammatically perfect sentences, and the other person speaks in poetry and metaphor and images that convey meaning in ways that grammar can't capture. Both are communication, both are valid, but they're operating on completely different levels. Clapton plays another solo, and you can hear him trying harder now, trying to match the intensity and originality that Jimi is bringing, but the more he tries to break free from his technical training and play with the kind of wild expressiveness that Jimi has, the more he sounds like someone trying to speak a language they don't actually know. Jimi responds with a solo that uses techniques that Clapton has never seen, playing behind his head not as a gimmick, but because it actually creates different tonal possibilities, using feedback in ways that sound intentional and musical rather than accidental, creating sounds that seem impossible to generate from a standard electric guitar. They play for maybe 15 minutes, trading solos back and forth, and with each exchange it becomes more obvious to everyone in the room that something unprecedented is happening. Clapton is brilliant, technically perfect, playing exactly the way a blues guitar should be played according to every rule and tradition. But Jimi is doing something else entirely. Something that makes those rules seem limited and constraining. Something that suggests the guitar can be so much more than anyone previously imagined. Jack Bruce later said in an interview that during this jam session, he watched Eric Clapton's confidence visibly drain out of him, watched him go from the assured master of his instrument to someone who was confused and maybe a little frightened by what he was hearing, by the realization that his entire approach to guitar might be just one small corner of a much larger universe of possibility that he had never even considered. When the jam ends, there's a long moment of silence. Nobody knows what to say. The usual compliments that musicians trade after playing together feel inadequate for what just happened. Clapton unplugs his guitar and says he needs a break, needs some air. He walks out of the studio into the December afternoon. Chas Chandler later testified that he followed Clapton outside and found him standing in the parking lot, staring at nothing, his guitar case at his feet. Chandler asked if he was okay. Clapton turned to him and said something that Chandler remembered clearly 50 years later. Clapton said, "You didn't tell me he was that good. You said he was flashy and loud. You didn't say he was going to make me feel like I've been wasting my time for the past 5 years." Chandler tried to reassure him, said that Jimi's style was different, not better, that they were two different approaches to the same instrument. Clapton shook his head. He said it wasn't about different approaches. He said what he just experienced was watching someone do things with the guitar that he didn't know were possible, and that the worst part wasn't that Jimi could do these things, but that Clapton realized he could never do them. that his entire foundation as a musician was built on a set of assumptions that Jimi had just proven were limitations rather than rules. Back inside the studio, Jimi is talking with the engineers, asking technical questions about the equipment, completely unaware of the existential crisis he's just created for Eric Clapton. A session musician who was there said that Jimi seemed genuinely humble, genuinely interested in learning from the studio professionals, not arrogant or boastful about what he had just demonstrated. Someone asks Jimi where he learned to play like that. Jimi's response is vague, says he's been playing for years, picked things up from different people, listened to a lot of records, just tried to find his own way of making the sounds he heard in his head. It's not a satisfying answer because it doesn't explain how someone develops that level of original technique, that degree of innovation, but it's the only answer Jimi gives. The studio manager suggests they should record some of what they just played, that it would be valuable to have documentation of this session. But Clapton, who has come back inside, says no, says he's not feeling it today, says maybe some other time. His face is pale. His hands are shaking slightly. People who saw him in that moment said he looked like someone who had just received devastating news, like something he valued had been taken from him. The session breaks up. Jimi thanks everyone for letting him play, says it was an honor to jam with Cream, completely sincere and unaware that he's just destroyed the confidence of one of London's guitar gods. Jimi and Chandler leave. Cream stays in the studio but doesn't accomplish much more that day. Jack Bruce later said that after Jimi left, Clapton tried to play, but nothing sounded right to him anymore. Everything seemed inadequate compared to what they had just heard. They eventually gave up and ended the session early. An engineer who worked that day said that before he left, Clapton sat alone in the studio for over an hour, just playing quiet blues patterns, looking lost. The engineer asked if there was anything he needed, any settings he wanted to adjust. Clapton said no, he was just trying to figure something out, trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him yet. What happened in the days and weeks following that session at Olympic Studios has been documented by multiple sources and confirmed by Clapton himself in interviews decades later. Clapton became obsessed with Jimi Hendrix. He went to every Jimi Hendrix Experience show he could attend, standing in the audience or watching from the side of the stage, studying every move, every technique, every sound that Jimi created. Other musicians noticed this and found it strange. Why would Eric Clapton, the established guitar god, be following around this new American player like a student studying a master? But those who understood what had happened at Olympic Studios knew that Clapton wasn't just interested in Jimi's playing. He was trying to rebuild his entire understanding of what guitar could be, trying to incorporate what he had learned from watching Jimi, even though his technical foundation made it almost impossible for him to play in the free, expressive style that came so naturally to Jimi. Clapton's playing changed after meeting Jimi. If you listen to Cream recordings before and after December 1966, you can hear the difference. The later material has more experimentation, more willingness to use feedback and distortion, more attempts to break free from the rigid blues structures that had defined Clapton's style. But it's also clear that Clapton is working against his own training, fighting his instinct for technical perfection to try to achieve the kind of emotional rawness that Jimi had. Some critics praised this evolution. Others said Clapton was losing his unique voice by trying to imitate Hendrix. The truth was more complex. Clapton wasn't trying to imitate Jimi. He was trying to unlearn limitations that he hadn't known were limitations until he heard someone who had never learned them in the first place. The most famous documentation of how deeply that Olympic Studios session affected Clapton comes from an interview he gave in 2017, 50 years after the event. The interviewer asked about meeting Jimi Hendrix for the first time. Clapton's response was raw and honest in a way that surprised people who knew him as usually guarded about his emotions. He said that session destroyed him, that he went home that night and cried, actually cried, because he realized that everything he thought he knew about guitar was incomplete, that he had been working within such a narrow definition of what the instrument could do that he had missed entire continents of possibility. He said that for months afterward he considered quitting guitar entirely because he couldn't see the point of continuing when someone else had already gone so far beyond anything he would ever be capable of. He said that meeting Jimi Hendrix was the most humbling experience of his life, more humbling than any failure or criticism, because it came from witnessing excellence that he couldn't even properly understand, let alone match. The people who were at Olympic Studios that December afternoon The engineers and musicians and studio staff who witnessed the 3-hour jam session between Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix all tell the same story with remarkable consistency even decades later. They talk about watching someone who believed he was the best guitarist in the world discover that he wasn't even playing the same game as someone else in the room. They talk about the visible shift in Clapton's demeanor, from confident to confused to something like grief. They talk about how the energy in the studio changed, how what started as a casual jam session became something heavier and more significant. A turning point not just for Clapton but for everyone who understood what they were witnessing. They talk about how after Jimi left, nobody could quite meet each other's eyes, how there was a shared awareness that they had just watched something important and disturbing, a changing of the guard, the moment when the old way of playing guitar was revealed to be just one option among many, and not necessarily the best option. In the years that followed, Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix developed a friendship based on mutual respect, though it was always colored by the knowledge that their first meeting had left Clapton emotionally devastated. They played together at various times, collaborated on ideas, influenced each other's music. When Jimi died in September 1970, Clapton was among those who spoke about the loss in personal terms, about how much Jimi had taught him, about how much further Jimi could have gone if he had lived. But he also spoke, in private conversations that were later recounted by friends, about how part of him felt relieved that he would no longer have to live in the shadow of someone whose talent made him feel inadequate, no matter how much success he achieved. It was an honest admission of complicated emotions, the recognition that genius in others can be both inspiring and crushing, especially when you have built your identity on being the best at something and then discover that best is a relative term. The graffiti that said Clapton is God didn't disappear immediately after December 1966, but its meaning changed. Those who knew the story of what happened at Olympic Studios understood that the title was now ironic, or at least incomplete. Clapton might be a god, but he had met someone who played by different rules, who had access to powers that Clapton couldn't quite grasp. The legend of that 3-hour session grew over time, embellished in some tellings but fundamentally accurate in its core truth, that Eric Clapton called Jimi Hendrix loud noise, and then had to face the reality that the noise contained music he had never imagined was possible, music that made his own carefully constructed perfection seem limited and small. It's a story about hubris and humbling, about the danger of believing you've mastered something when you've only mastered one approach to it, about how the arrival of true innovation can make even the greatest talents feel like beginners again. When you listen to Eric Clapton's music now, knowing this story, you can hear the tension in his playing, the push and pull between his classical training and his desire to break free into something wilder and more expressive. You can hear the influence of Jimi Hendrix in the moments when Clapton lets go of control and allows the guitar to feedback and sustain and create sounds that are more about feeling than precision. And you can understand why Clapton still speaks about meeting Jimi with a mixture of reverence and pain, why 50 years later he can't tell the story without his voice breaking, why that December afternoon in Olympic Studios remains one of the defining moments of his life. Because it's one thing to be beaten by someone better at the game you're playing. It's another thing entirely to discover that while you were becoming the best at your game, someone else was inventing a completely different game that makes yours look quaint and limited. That's what happened to Eric Clapton in 3 hours at Olympic Studios, and he's never been the same since.